Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's seminar. My name is Shane Burke. I'm Head of Research at the Housing Agency, and I'd like to thank you all for attending today at the launch of our research report, which is Residential Satisfaction During the COVID-19 Pandemic in Ireland. So the running order today will be Bob Jordan, who'll provide an overview of the research and say a few words on it. That will be followed by Anne Murphy, who will provide the main research findings, and then Ronan Lyons will be providing a response to those findings. So I'll be chairing today's session, and I'll introduce the speakers, and at the end we'll have time for a Q&A. So please do submit any questions that you have using the Q&A function on Zoom. And with that, I'll hand you over to Bob Jordan, CEO of the Housing Agency.
Thanks a lot, Shane. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the launch of the Housing Agency report, Residential Satisfaction During the COVID-19 Pandemic in Ireland 2020. I'll make a few brief remarks before handing over to our speakers. Anne Murphy, Research Analyst with the Housing Agency, who'll present you with the more detailed findings, and Ronan Lyons, Associate Professor of Economics at Trinity College Dublin, a member of the Housing Commission. And the Housing Agency has been keeping Ronan busy recently. He spoke most recently a couple of weeks ago at our Land Series talks about land value tax, and we're really grateful for Ronan joining us again today. The Housing Agency's purpose is obviously to provide expertise and solutions to help deliver sustainable communities throughout Ireland, and supporting our stakeholders with good quality research and data is really essential in achieving this. We've a dedicated and experienced research team led by Shane, who's chairing the session, and we conduct research, as you know, on a wide variety of topics, and this helps us all to better understand the housing system. In relation to today's report, it's the 5th report in a research series about housing attitudes and aspirations that began in 2018, and we've gone through 3 research waves so far. The aim is to understand how people experience their homes and neighbourhoods, and to learn a little bit more about their future housing plans. So the research provides important information on affordability, neighbourhood satisfaction, and people's housing journeys or housing careers. And obviously, this 2020 research covers a very particular time in Ireland and indeed for the world as we dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic. And for this research, we added a specific module to collect information about people's experience of the pandemic and how it affected their housing attitudes and aspirations. So, for example, we asked questions about working from home, the way people experience their neighbourhoods during COVID, and how it has affected, the pandemic has affected their housing aspirations and thoughts about their housing choices in the future. Obviously, Anne will go on to provide a detailed overview of the research in her presentation, but I'd just like to highlight a few high-level important findings. I suppose the first thing, and maybe it's really important, is that people overall are very happy with their homes and with their neighbourhoods. However, having said that, there are disparities. For example, homeowners have higher levels of satisfaction with their homes and neighbourhoods than renters. There's a whole pile of reasons for that Anne will go into. But obviously, it is to do with things like security of tenure, affordability, inside and outside space, and so on. And I suppose we in the Housing Agency, because we've been, I suppose, playing a pivotal role in the rollout of cost rental housing and that sort of new affordable secure tenure, hope that going forward, the cost rental will help to increase overall satisfaction within the rented sector. The research also found that 50% of householders have experienced difficulties in keeping their homes warm. And I suppose, given the pressure that households are under in relation to utility costs and inflation at the moment, this will be a question to watch in the next iteration of the research this year. I suppose in thinking about their future, as the world became smaller, perhaps people's aspirations became bigger in terms of their future housing aspirations. So for example, just under 50% of householders who are considering moving home stated that they would be open to moving to locations that are different to those that they would have considered before the pandemic. And I think we can probably all relate to that. I suppose finally, just in relation to the research series itself, I mean, part of its strengths are that it's repeated. and that it's very responsive. As we've seen, we've been able to ask particular questions about COVID-19. And obviously, as the housing market changes, the study can be adapted to capture new information, and that's our intention. To date, almost 4,000 householders have been surveyed, 1,500 in the 2020 iteration, and the data collected has great potential for future insights really on a broad range of housing topics. Just to say, I know there's a lot of researchers looking in today. The data collected over the course of this series is incredibly rich. We've already made 2 data sets available to the Irish Social Science Data Archive, and obviously more information to follow. And this data is free and available for researchers to use, and we hope you do so. The 4th wave of the research is due to begin shortly. We look forward to working with Behaviour and Attitudes, who are awarded the contract for 2023. If you have ideas about unstudied areas or questions that we should be asking or could be asking that would benefit from inclusion in this research, please let us know. And finally, I'd like to thank our speakers, obviously Anne Murphy from our own research section, thank Ronan again for being with us today to respond to the research, thank our head of research, Shane Burke, chairing this session, and all of the entire research team, but most of all, thanking you for tuning in today to hear a little bit more about this work. Thank you. Thanks, Shane.
Thank you very much, Bob. So now I'll hand you over to Anne Murphy, Research Analyst at the Housing Agency, to provide the findings of today's report.
Through some high-level findings from the 2020 report over the next 15 minutes or so, and just to start off by telling you that this was the 3rd wave in our national study series, and in it we repeated modules about housing and neighbourhood.
Sorry, Anne, we were having a little bit of trouble seeing your screen there. Would you mind? Could you just reshare your screen for us? Yes, please.
Right.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, we can see your screen now. Thank you, Anne.
You can see it. Great. Where did I get to just to pick up?
I think you were just speaking about the that it's part of a broader series.
That's great, thank you. What we did for the 2020 study was that we were obviously in an unplanned pandemic, so we took the opportunity to add in a module for questions to see, was it going to was the experience of being restricted to home going to affect your experience of home, if you see what I mean. And so in that way, actually very timely for us. We did have to make changes because of the pandemic to our survey. Our fieldwork changed season from spring to winter, and we moved to an online survey where it had been face-to-face with an interviewer in people's homes. In 2020, we went for a sample drawn from a panel of 1,500 householders, quota controlled by gender, social class, region, and matched to the 2016 census. So the first measure I want to tell you about is housing satisfaction. And we simply asked householders, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with your current home? And they could rate it from 1 to 5, 1 being very dissatisfied and 5 is very satisfied. And we can see here on the first bar in the chart, this is for the overall sample, 66% that they said that they were satisfied or very satisfied with their home. But when you look at it by tenure, you can see that renters, only 50% say they're satisfied or very satisfied, compared with 77% of owners. If we take this same measure, and we've asked this in each wave, and I just need to put in a caveat that this is not a time series, but it is the same question asked of nationally representative samples in each wave. So I thought you would be interested in seeing it. And although it's not a time series, we can still actually see patterns in this. We can see that owners consistently have higher levels of satisfaction with their homes than renters. And we can see for the first time actually in the 2020 results over on the right-hand side, that levels of dissatisfaction are high compared with any other wave. This seems to be reflecting to me some kind of COVID pandemic lockdown influence, that people are spending more time at home and therefore are in their home more and maybe becoming dissatisfied for a number of different reasons. But we did try and dig into changing attitudes. So we asked during COVID, so we asked householders, had their experience changed about how they felt about their homes since March 2020, which was the beginning of the lockdowns. And what we see is 33% of the main sample feel more positive about their home. But, 17% feel more negative. So it seems to be a polarization in how people feel about their home. And again, we can see that characteristic difference between renters and owners, with fewer renters, 30% of renters as opposed to 40% of owners, feeling more positive about their home. And more, the proportion of renters feeling more negative about their home is twice that of owners at 10%. We then focused a little bit on issues to do with the home, and we asked about issues with the dwelling for 13 different items, which you can see laid out there. Owners are in grey and renters are in black. You can see that the issue with the highest level of problems is for renters is shortage of space. And again, I think this is probably reflecting our homes having to do more work for us during COVID. And when the survey took place in December 2020, we were in level 3 restrictions. So we really were very tied to our homes. Then the second highest finding for renters of problem is difficulty keeping the house warm at 60%, but it's also 43% of owners. And this is quite high compared with other in the survey, other responses to this question in the survey. So I've just, this is the same question, heating with the home from the 3 waves. And you can see 2018 and 2019 are very consistent with each other. Although 2018 is asking homeowners, or sorry, pardon me, householders who live in houses and apartments, and 2019 is focusing on apartment residents only. They're very consistent in saying that, 16% find that heating their home is somewhat or a big problem. But in 2020, 50% of all householders are saying that heating their home is a problem. Now, there might be some seasonality in here because it was a winter survey as opposed to a spring survey for the first 2 waves. But there's also very likely we're spending more time at home. There's also likely to be some kind of COVID effect in this. Looking again across the 3 waves for the shortage of space, we can see that in 2019, 32% of apartment residents say shortage of space is a problem for them. This is perhaps not very surprising. So when we look at 2020 and we find a higher proportion, 43% are saying that shortage of space is a problem for them. And this includes people living in houses as well as apartments. That is somewhat surprising and is perhaps reflecting that our homes had to work so hard for us during COVID. So to move away from the home now and to turn towards neighbourhood, we asked our respondents about their levels of neighbourhood satisfaction. And like the other measure, they could rate it from 1 to 5, and 5 was very satisfied. You can see in the main sample that 80% found that their neighbourhood, they were satisfied or very satisfied with it. And when we look at it by tenure, we can see again, there's that difference between renters and owners, and 66% of renters being very satisfied or satisfied compared with 92%. But unlike housing satisfaction across, whether we look at the main sample or by tenure, levels of neighbourhood satisfaction for all these categories are higher than they are for housing satisfaction. And again, these are the results for this question across the 3 waves of the survey. And so in 2020, when level 3 restrictions were in place during fieldwork, what we see in the 2020 results are higher levels, a first instance of high levels of dissatisfaction being reported, particularly by renters. And I think that is quite striking, that 15% of renters have said they're dissatisfied or very dissatisfied. And I think this probably is reflecting the COVID experience. Changing then attitudes to neighbourhood, we asked a similar question as we had about attitudes to homes changing. And we see that 23% of the overall of all householders felt more positive about their neighbourhood. And again, renters, this is a lower proportion felt more positive. It's 2/3 of the homeowners who said their feelings were more positive. But that polarity that we see in the housing satisfaction is not quite an evidence about how people's feelings have changed about their neighbourhood here. It's not as polarised as this question is about homes. So we do see a little bit of a paradox, I think, in the data here. And all householders report lower satisfaction levels with their homes than their neighbourhoods, but attitudes to home have become more polarised than it has for neighbourhoods. So actually more householders feel more positive about their homes. It needs a little bit of digging into, I feel. And just to move away from this towards affordability, and these are the findings from this question. Renters, how difficult did they find paying their rent? And we asked owners how difficult did they find meeting their mortgage. These are the findings from the 3 years. And we can see that the 2019 result is the one that actually stands out. And again, this is apartment residents, and they have a different pattern of tenure within apartments. There are far more renters as a proportion than there are owners. So this is a standalone result, the 2019, very much so. 2018 and 2020 are both householders. And actually, although it's not a trend series, the results are very similar, in fact, considering, I find this a little surprising. There might have been more impact, I feel, of the different measures during COVID aimed towards renters being able to stay in their homes, and maybe some of the reliefs that were in place. So, and taking that idea that there were measures in place, we asked renters about how secure they felt their tenure was in the 2020 result. And this chart is showing you broken down by social renters and private renters. And 60% of social were very secure, compared with 46% of private renters. And this is the same measure asked in our 3 waves. So when we consider the findings for this measure in each wave, we can see that in the 2018 and 2019, most private and social renters report feeling secure or very secure in similar proportions. Although within the 2 levels, social renters report higher levels of tenure security than private renters. For example, 36% of social renters in 2018 feel very secure, compared with 25% of private renters. But when we consider the 2020 wave, the expectation might be that security of tenure would be by a greater proportion of renters as secure and very secure in a time of the pandemic due to the ban on evictions. But this is not what the data shows. Both social renters and private renters report higher levels of insecurity than the other 2 waves did, with 19% of social renters and 20% of private renters reporting low levels of tenure security. This finding is quite stark, as despite the eviction ban, 1/5 of both social and private renters believe their tenancy to be insecure. And moving away then from housing and neighbourhoods and affordability, and towards intentions for the future and housing aspirations. We asked our respondents, how likely are you to move to another home in the future? And 1/3 of our main sample said it was likely or very likely that they would move to another home. And over half of our renters intend to move to another home in the future, compared to 1/5 of owners. And as Bob mentioned, we found with the chart on the left that all householders, half of all householders who intend to move, would consider new locations that they hadn't thought of before the pandemic had begun. And unsurprisingly, when we look at this by tenure, renters are far more likely to consider a new location. And I think that does chime with our own experience of the pandemic. When we asked those who were considering moving to a new location, where would they move to? We can see that rural areas, whether a village or open countryside, people are considering moving to rural areas, 40% to a village and 30% to open countryside. And this is a new finding, I think. It's showing that people are considering moving away from the centres. So although there are moves to come into centres, satellite urban towns and cities, this is the first time I think that we're seeing a move in the other direction coming through in our data. And just to actually move back to our 2019 and this idea of future aspiration. This time we were, in the 2019, it was a survey of apartment residents, and we were asking about how they felt about where apartments figured in their future plans, and particularly about families in apartments. And we found that 66% of renters in private developments think that apartments can be a good place to raise children. And 70% of all apartment residents, whether renters or owners, think that their neighbourhood is a good place to raise children. I'm really just bringing this in to give a flavour that how people feel about where they could live in the future is broader than some of the rhetoric might suggest. And also, just to draw your attention to our 2019 survey, people who already live in apartments, 1/5 would prefer their next home to be an apartment. And I think this is a very interesting finding. It is true that 68% of apartment residents would like to move to a 2-storey house. But if you contrast this to both the 2018 and the 2020 surveys, 6%, it's only 6% of all householders would prefer to live in an apartment. And I'm going to start wrapping up now. What I'd like to do is show you our 5 reports, and they're all available from our housing agency website under publications. We also have 3 data sets at the moment this year. 2 are deposited with ISDA up in UCD, and the link to that is on my final slide. And we'll be adding in the last 2 over the year. And Bob has mentioned that we're going out to the field again in this year. So we're going to continue with the broad research question, but I think as you have probably picked up, we're going to investigate the legacy, if there is a legacy from the pandemic, on householders' experiences and aspirations for their homes. And we will actually have a second, the 2023 study will provide a second point in time for a trend series where we'll be able to compare it with our 2018 survey. So we're really looking forward to that development. We also plan to develop the qualitative side of the survey, and we are looking forward to working with behaviours and attitudes who were awarded a contract, as Bob mentioned. So I'm going to leave it there and hand back to Shane.
Thanks very much for that, Anne. A really good summary of the findings of this report and of course the series more broadly. So I'll now hand you over to Ronan Lyons, Associate Professor of Economics at Trinity College Dublin, who's going to provide a response to those findings. So over to you, Ronan.
Thank you very much, Shane, and thank you to the Housing Agency for the invitation to come and respond to Anne's presentation and to the hard work that's been done by the agency over the last few years, putting together this really interesting data set. So what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about what I learned, not to repeat necessarily too much, but just to give some things that I found interesting in it, and then maybe to think about what we could do. I sort that's maybe a possessive we, but what we as a country could do when thinking about this survey going forward and using the information that's in there. And one point I had was about housing preferences. Another was about housing for older persons. And the last point is about how this survey might help us understand suppressed household formation. So to start, I guess what I learned from this, and some of it Anne has obviously covered, but I think the impact of COVID-19, it's somebody like me as a trained economist will always look at prices. So broadly speaking, when if you wanted to understand, say, the impact of what would the willingness to pay be among residents of an area to have more green space, or a bicycle lane, or light rail in their neighborhood. And there's two broad categories that social scientists think of. The first are what are known as stated preferences. So you ask them a survey, or conduct a survey, and you ask them in the survey, how much would you be willing to pay for something? And the other way of looking at it, and they're not, it's not either or, generally you try and do both. But the other way of looking at it is revealed preferences. So you don't ask them, you just watch what they do. And with modern methods in social sciences, you can, for example, uncover willingness to pay for green space using, for example, housing market data. Do people pay more rent, or more, or are they willing to pay more in rent or more in house prices and sale prices to live, for example, near the Phoenix Park? And the ESRI has a paper out a number of years ago, maybe about 15 years ago, using those methods and uncovering the sort of the implicit value of the Phoenix Park. My training kind of leads me towards those kind of revealed preference methods in general. So I've been looking at, for example, the CSO or RTB or DAFT measures of sale and rental prices over the last couple of years, sort of trying to read the tea leaves. What can we see from changes in prices in both segments, sales and rentals? And there you could see that something was definitely happening over the course of, say, the 15 to 18 months from early 2020 to late 2021. There was a definite shift. The first thing that happened was effectively away from Dublin. The Dublin premium shrank over those 18 months. The first wave, you could see it in the other cities. They went up in prices as Dublin stalled. And then as Dublin prices increased, prices everywhere increased faster than in Dublin. And some of that might be a flight from expensive markets, but some of it might also be a change in preferences. And how do you distinguish between those two? Well, you could do even more intricate measures of revealed preference, or you could look, as this survey does, you can ask people how they feel. Now, both have their limitations, but together both have more power. And that's one of the key points I guess I wanted to make today, is that this survey on its own is valuable, and this survey in combination with other information sources is really valuable. And that's why I think it's definitely worth its weight. I think the timing of the surveys means that we can only read so much with the last survey into what the impact of COVID-19 might have been. The next wave of the survey, I think, will be critical in understanding which of the results persist beyond. There's one on the shortage of space, for example, as by far the biggest issue that people stated. How much of that will have gone when people are allowed more than 2 or 5 kilometers from their home and are back in the office at least some of the time, as much as they want? So that I think is really interesting for me. A second point is differences and in parallels between apartments and houses. There are clearly different issues that arise, but yet there are many things that are in common. So often, I don't want to oversimplify, but often people highlighted the limits of their dwellings. So think of it as the structure, and then the attractions of their neighborhoods. So when people think of their home, they're thinking about as much about their neighborhood as they are about the structure itself. And I think that would be, for me, it'd be nice to see that formalized maybe in the next wave of the report, that your neighborhood is part of your home. It's not the structure, but it's a key part of why you, if you got to choose, why you chose the place where you live. So there's a structure bit and there's a location bit, or a dwelling in a neighborhood bit, but both of those feed into home. And that's maybe one suggestion I have for, rather than home, I think a couple of times home and dwelling are put together. But for me, home is above the dwelling. It's the two put together. We have apartments and houses. The other thing was about owner occupiers and renters. And a suggestion I have here might be to think about that four-way split, that you've got owner occupiers in houses, you've got renters in houses, you've got owner occupiers in apartments and renters in apartments. Clearly, with only so many responses, it may be the case that some segments are small. Having worked in the past on owner occupied apartments, I know that it's a struggle to find areas where there are lots of owner occupiers in apartments. But even having that set up, perhaps in a few years' time, there will be more, with Pre-Conaha and other initiatives, there will be more owner occupiers in apartments, and that 2-by-2 split will at least help, I suppose, avoid the conflation of tenure and dwelling type, which many of us can slip into. I often do as well. And the survey I found also quite helpful in thinking about the life cycle of housing, right? So if we think about the mid-20th century, and I have given this example before, so apologies if you've heard me say it before, but in the 1950s, the life expectancy for, I think for men was 65, and for women it might have been 68. But in the 1950s in Ireland, we lived with our parents till probably 20, 21, 22. You got married, you had your own family starting in your early 20s. And by the time the youngest of your kids left, you were in your early 60s, and then you died, right? So when you think of it from a housing typology point of view, there's really only one kind of dwelling that you need, and it's the family home. But if you go to the mid-21st century and you do the same life cycle, right? Up until 18, you're at home with your parents. Then you go to college and you're going to need purpose-built student accommodation. And then you're going to need accommodation that suits somebody who's just moved to a city. So it could be co-living, or it could be a rental market that allows you to find somewhere to live when you don't know anyone, or you know very few people. But then there will be the bit, what you might call the pre-family bit, where you found your partner, but you're choosing not to have children until 34, 35. So there could be 5 up to 10 years of a type of housing that is not a family house, but it's pre-family housing. And of course, there will be no family households as well. People who choose not to have children, that's a greater share now of couples. And then you don't drop dead at 65 anymore. You might live till 95, right? Certainly by the mid-21st century, the trend suggests that we will live until our 90s. So there could be up to 30 years after the kids have flown the nest, if you had kids, where there are other kinds of housing that we will need, that we do not have in Ireland really at the moment, at least not at scale. Independent living, assisted living, and of course nursing homes. But nursing homes really are at the last kind of, it's months, not years, typically in other countries for nursing homes. But this survey, I think, can help even with awareness, but also understanding the preferences around different kinds of housing, and can act as a lead as well as just a simple measure. So I mentioned before about the power of evidence combined, that this survey is useful in and of itself, and it's also useful when combined with other sources of information. And one that I have, and I said I'll be the first to admit this, I have been sort of sitting on and not using, is that Daft have a quarterly sentiment survey asking people about what they think is happening in the market, but it also asks them if they're interested in buying a property, and if so, what kinds of properties would they be interested in, where, what kinds of budgets, what they think is driving the market at the moment, all those kinds of questions, some of which overlap with this and overlap in a useful way. So the 2019 survey found that most people who live in apartments think that they would be fine for families, for raising a family. Even aside from the families bit, it shows that people who live in apartments don't want to just get out. right, which I think is portrayed, I'm not blaming anyone in particular, but you can get a sense in the general discussion around apartments that they're sort of temporary, that Irish people don't do apartments. But people who live in apartments are happy to live in them and happy for families to live in them and think that they would work. Right? So that suggests that exposure to being in an apartment helps allay any fears. But also, in the sentiment survey with Datasets, on the right-hand side, you can see there the fraction of respondents who are active in the market, so they're looking for a place to buy. And when we ask them what kinds of properties they would like to buy, that includes about 50% of respondents in Dublin and about 40% in the other cities would include apartments in that. And that went, it didn't seem to go down significantly. It's been trending up. It didn't seem to go down significantly during the pandemic for both Dublin and the other cities combined. It's higher in 2021 than it was in 2015 or 16. And for me, assembling that statistic was an eye opener for me, especially combined with the information in the survey, because it powerfully goes against the idea that the lack of apartments in Ireland is somehow to do with a lack of demand. It's a lack of supply. We do not have the apartments that the country wants to have. And I think that is really useful for policymakers to be able to piece together from different bits of information. I've mentioned a little bit about the diversity of homes needed. I think understandably in preparing the results of the report, you've got to pick the dimensions that you're going to look at. So urban versus rural, owner occupiers versus renters, social versus market rent, and so on. But I do think that especially as the waves of the survey add up, that breakdowns by age would be useful too, even if it's a 2- or 3-way breakdown of age. Because there's evidence from the 2016 survey that the Housing Agency sponsored. It was a study on housing for older persons, that when you asked them if they liked their home, they said yes, overwhelmingly. Then you asked them what they liked about their home, and they said the neighborhood, the family and friends were near, say if they needed medical supports, that those were close by, and so on. So their networks were in their area. When you asked them what they didn't like about their home, they listed some of the stuff you can see on the right there. So there was this dichotomy between the neighborhood and the dwelling that really, when I was going through the survey, really reminded me, the results here really reminded me of that. And I would suggest that a potential future module would be to do a follow-up to the 2016 study, focusing on housing preferences of the over 65s, not least because almost all the population growth that Ireland is going to see over the next 30 years is going to be concentrated in those age groups, over 65s. My last point then is around suppressed household formation. Understandably, you can only survey households that exist in a survey of households. However, that doesn't stop us, or indeed it doesn't stop the Housing Agency thinking about how they might get at households that would have existed if housing conditions were different. And what I'm particularly thinking of here are younger adult cohorts. So we have one of the highest shares in Europe of 18 to 34-year-olds living at home with their parents, and it's a relatively new phenomenon. So if you go back 10 years, the average age of leaving the parental household was about 25. So in adult years, it's like 7. So you're 18. You're not going to leave before 18. So it was 7, and that's increased by about 50%. That age, it's now about 10 or 11 adult years until you leave, and that's just in the last 10 years. So that is a hard stat that backs up anecdotally what we are sensing, that younger adults are justifiably, in my view, annoyed at the lack of housing that is being given to them. In other words, they would be forming households if the housing system were healthier, because they are not getting captured in surveys of households. What we could do, so my suggestion here is have a module, which is the analog to the one on older households, which looks at households with adult children, and maybe also households of unrelated adults. So one of the biggest growth categories of households in Ireland over the last 10 years has been households containing unrelated persons. But we don't have apartments for 1- and 2-person households. We just have houses. A slight simplification, but you get the idea. And then everyone has to fit into a house. So it could be a single person aged 80. It could be a couple in their 70s. It could be 3 young adults in their late 20s, early 30s, or it could be 6 students in their early 20s. All of them have to just find a 3 or 4 bed that works for them. And if we can include them into the survey, I think that would be a valuable addition. So I'll stop there. In fact, I stopped after the second word of that bullet point, a valuable. I hope the rest of the context was clear. Thanks for your time and attention, and I'm looking forward to both the discussion now and to future waves and lots of research using these surveys.
Thanks very much for that, Ronan. Very interesting. I was struck by the importance you place on using this data in combination with other studies, which I think is very important. And also, thanks very much for suggestions as to future modules, perhaps one looking at the over 65s and one looking at younger cohorts. So I think you raised some excellent points there. If anybody has questions that they'd like me to raise now, please, as I said, put them into the Q&A function of this. We do have some here which I'll go through. Just one, and I suppose this will be for you. Is it possible to have the renters broken down by private local authority and approved housing body?
It is, yes. And what I should say is we have this very rich set of data. My plans for digging into it a lot more, because we've just done very high level, even in the published reports, is to start doing some of that deeper analysis and publishing it on the Housing Agency's data hub. And so it's really instantly available. So I'm hoping I would be doing that by the autumn. But again, dig into this by just some basic demographics, including age. That will be the place where that kind of output will go. And I guess it could be quite responsive to questions people actually have, you know. I'm hoping it'll be a shorter reporting cycle. So I would be going back over previous studies to put that kind of data in there, as well as the next wave. I hope that answered the question. We do have that data broken down by social and private renters. We will be looking at making that more accurate in how we describe those, because times have moved on since the question was first designed. I would say on approved housing bodies, we have very tiny numbers in approved housing bodies, but we have very decent counts for the other two.
Thanks very much for that, Anne. And if anyone has any sort of detailed questions like that they'd like to come back to the Housing Agency with, you know, further queries in relation to data, please, you know, contact us after the webinar. We'd be happy to assist you. Another question then is, when you looked at the intention to move, was there any distinction between those who want to move because they want to, that's part of their aspirations, or versus those who felt forced to move, or that they would be required to move due to, for example, the lease might be ending or something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. What we have are a whole series of questions about tracking people's housing journeys, what's happened to them up to this point where they took the survey. And in that, we'll have asked them, you know, questions about exactly that. Were you forced to move? Did you have to move? Did, you know, for tenants and this, and how difficult was your journey? And actually we have very deep, rich data on that. But this question on intention to move, straightforward as it was asked, it was for whatever reason people might answer, but what are your intentions for the future? So it wasn't in the context when it was asked, it was asked in the context of a kind of a what would you like, forward focused question. It wasn't based on their housing journey to that point and having had to leave accommodation for any of the reasons that are in the question, you know, like a lease ending. What was their future hope and aspiration? Did they intend to move? So I hope that answers the question. It's very future focused, that question.
Thanks a lot, Anne. And Ronan, then, having looked at all the series as well as the most recent report, is there anything that struck you as surprising when you went through the findings of either this report or previous iterations compared to what you had sort of learned about people's aspirations?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I highlighted, I guess, some of the stuff that struck me earlier on. I guess the one that jumps out at me straight away, so I guess that's probably the one that is the right answer, right? If it's the one that comes to my head first, is the shortage of space, and it seems to be across all. From my memory, and can correct me if I'm wrong, it seemed to be across houses and apartments. It wasn't like, oh, some people have to live in shoe boxes and therefore they don't have space, but if you get to a house, you're fine. It was far more general than that. And hence I'm kind of curious to see what comes out of the next one, because as Anne mentioned, if you're asking people at precisely the time that they have to stay inside in their structure as much as legally required, I guess, as it was at the time, then you might get a different answer to now. So I'm kind of curious to see how that one goes. We have, in some ways, it's less surprising if you think of, there's evidence from the US and indeed from Ireland and elsewhere that the value of an extra square meter or an extra room has gone up in the last couple of years, because people are now thinking about a home office or a space that's equivalent to a home office. So that doesn't surprise me too much, but I was surprised to see it feature so prominently. The other thing, I guess, if you'll permit me to list a second, was issues around heating at a time when this was not an issue. Sorry, it was not an issue at a national level. It was clearly an issue for quite a lot of people. Yeah. And I thought it was quite interesting because there is definitely a challenge around the quality of the housing stock in general in Ireland, its energy efficiency, and retrofitting has become it's close to the top of the agenda now when we think about the housing stock. But I was surprised to see it feature so prominently in 2020 when we were, Ukraine and everything that's happened since the invasion of Ukraine is only in the last year. So those are the two that stick out to me.
Thanks very much, Ron. And I suppose international, because I know you referred to international studies there, and there's a very extensive literature review of what happened internationally during the pandemic. So is there any ways in which we're different or similar when we compare ourselves to other countries in relation to the sort of issues that the report identified?
Well, now that's quite a tricky question. The lit review, the lit search for that review took place in October 2020, and there were no empirical studies about satisfaction level with housing because of living through a pandemic. So actually that lit review is, the topics in it were housing and the pandemic. There was plenty about the health link, and that is what really struck me, the health link between housing conditions and impact on health. So the poorer the housing, the worse your health outcome. And this was more exacerbated because people were spending more time at home. So the link became more evident. There were things in it, I was really struck by, yes, how international actually the response and how similar the response. I looked for papers from for globally that had made it into the literature, didn't restrict it to a geographical area. And the experience was very similar across completely different countries and jurisdictions, particularly the response to getting us outside and putting in bike lanes, or we're eating outside now, or there was a lot of similarity in how governments seem to have responded as well to what happened, the supports renters would experience. Now, this is not surprising in some way, particularly in westernized countries. There was a real consistency there. But, a lot of the commentary, a lot of the stuff that I was reading at the time were architects responding to the pandemic and focused on, is our home working for us now? We're repurposing. Open plan is maybe wanting to become broken plan because we're all so noisy when we're all in the house together. And will this be something that lasts? And that is what I'm very interested in coming back to. But so it's quite a tricky question, Shane, because there still aren't a huge number of studies like ours, which look at how people feel, their attitudes and their experiences, which is why it does, I think, throw more light on some of the economic findings. You know, how do people feel, and what will the intention to move turn into real action? Can we somehow find answers to that? The last thing that really struck me was the importance of green spaces. That came through in the literature just time and time again, whether it was the main focus of any particular paper. We mentioned green spaces, which I haven't in this run through today, but it's there, you know.
Absolutely, that was very striking. And Ronan, I'll just give you the opportunity to add to that, or are you happy enough for me to move on to the next question?
Yeah, maybe let's go to the next question if it's the one that's open there.
Yeah, absolutely. So why do so many apartment residents want to move to two-story houses?
Can I maybe offer my thoughts, free of the constraints of having studied it as well as Anne? So she will be constrained by what the data actually says, and I can be more speculative. For me, I think it goes back to the point I was making about the life cycle. To me, it's perfectly normal for people to live in an apartment at a certain point in their life, and then to move into a house, and then to move back into an apartment potentially down the line. So there's nothing concerning to me about seeing that. What would be more concerning is, and I think I was probably hinting at this, and maybe I haven't actually explicitly said this like this before. So, but to see so many people wanting to buy an apartment and not being able to, or wanting to live in an apartment and not being able to, that would be concerning to me. So 50% of people in Dublin and 40% of people in other cities are willing to buy an apartment if they could find one that suited their budget, but they can't because we've only 12-15% of our dwelling stock is in apartments. That suggests to me that we're not getting the mix of dwellings right. So my take on it is that it's a perfectly normal part of the life cycle of housing, and that I wouldn't interpret that as people who are in apartments just want to get out of them as soon as they can. That would be my take, and Anne actually has interrogated the data, so I let her respond with that in mind.
Well, you know, I think it's a really good question, because the rhetoric is that we all want to live in a 3-bed house out in the suburbs. And indeed, the Department of Housing with Owen Corrigan's study has shown that that is a definite preference. But it does not mean that there is no desire to live in apartments. And what, you know, the DAF data was new to me, and the figures are high. And I think our survey is showing that there's a definite cohort of people for whom an apartment is their favorite next home. I think it's worth digging into and unpacking some of the received ideas that we have out there about apartment living, that we don't want to live there. Actually, quite a lot of us do want to live there. And I really do think that we could probably dig into the life cycle element of this, definitely with this data. I think there's probably hidden information in there already, depending on analysis, to dig into this a little bit more, to get at household formation. I think that is something I'm very interested in. What are our expectations as we move through the life course? And the life course is so different than it was, 50 years ago. What is this doing to what we want from our housing? So I think it's a huge subject, and there's so much to dig into.
Thanks very much, Anne. And I think so. We've no further questions here anyway, so I think we can leave it there. And I'd like to thank our contributors today, Bob Jordan, Anne Murphy, and Ronan Lyons. I think it's been a really interesting and insightful webinar. Also, thanks very much to everyone who's attended today. We very much appreciate that. And if you would like to visit the website, you can read this report or previous iterations on our publications page. Equally, if there's any follow-up questions that you haven't thought of today or you occur to you afterwards, please, you know, contact Anne Murphy or myself, and we'd be happy to provide you with any information that we can. But other than that, thanks very much, and thank you, Anne. Thank you, Ronan.